Alright, hello everybody. Welcome to our next lesson here. We're going to be talking about discrimination for the next couple of days or so, next couple of lessons. Excuse me. So today we're going to take a look at discrimination and race. Objectives and standards. You will be able to identify how discrimination is recognized under the law, and you will be able to explain how discrimination by race impacts Americans. Take a look at the standards there, please. Desired result. How is discrimination against race protected under the law? So, equality promised and denied. A right to equality is promised under the Declaration of Independence. However, the right of equality has not always been protected to everyone in the U.S. The way to judge equality has been discussed over time. Many laws, regulations, constitutional amendments, and court decisions have been used by government to combat discrimination in different forms. However, there have been many times when discrimination was legally enforced in the United States of America as well. Recognizing discrimination when a person is treated differently than other members of a society, they are facing discrimination. This usually occurs to people who are of a different race, national origin, gender, age, or religion. Some laws that discriminate are legal and typically accepted by members of society, such as having to be 16 years old before you can get a driver's license. You don't have 10-year-olds driving cars or things like that. Also, the age to buy tobacco or alcohol. You have to be 18 to buy tobacco, and you have to be 21 to purchase alcohol in our country. So, we don't have 7-year-olds smoking cigarettes or walking in alcohol stores and buying booze or beer or things like that. So, and those are typically accepted by, Americans as, they're discriminatory, but they're discriminatory for a good reason. Americans are protected from discrimination under the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, and discrimination laws are still debated and very controversial today. Judging discrimination. When a person claims to have faced discrimination, courts will use certain tests to decide if discrimination exists. The first one is A here, rational basis test. Does the law or the practice make sense for society? Example, the legal age to be allowed to marry. I know my wife and I got married, we had to say we were 18 years old. We were, adults and consenting adults. So, we don't allow, again, like 5-year-olds to walk into a courthouse or a church to get married. The strict scrutiny test, also with the rational basis test, we don't have 50-year-old men marrying 7-year-olds in our country, right? We make sure that's illegal. The strict scrutiny test, does the law or practice only apply to certain groups of people, such as for a while in our country, some states banned interracial couples from marrying. That was declared to be illegal later on, but in the beginning, many whites couldn't marry blacks or blacks couldn't marry whites, so that law was eventually thrown out as well. And C, the substantial relationship test, is there a close relationship between the law or the practice and certain groups of people? For example, here, not selling alcohol to men, but to women in a certain age group, because let's say 18 to 25-year-old men might be more likely to become alcoholics, and the law prohibits men 18 to 25 from buying alcohol. Well, that would be discriminatory because, in terms of substantial relationship to women, it's not to say that women who are 18 to 25 couldn't become alcoholics as well. So you can't discriminate based on one factor over another like that. A history of racial discrimination. Most Americans believe that discrimination based on race is morally wrong. However, laws and customs in the United States of America were not always that way. African Americans were especially discriminated against following the abolition of slavery after the Civil War. Jim Crow laws, which was a derogatory name from an old song, were used to separate African Americans from whites in schools and public facilities. The Supreme Court actually ruled in the decision of Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896, that separate but equal facilities were constitutional. This man here is Homer Plessy. He was a half African American man who tried to sit in a white railroad car or section of a railroad car. He was told he had to move. He refused to move, and he was arrested. He eventually took his case to the Supreme Court, saying that he was being discriminated against. And again, the Supreme Court actually said, no, you're not, that as long as you have a separate railroad car, you it's legal. However, the problem with separate but equal is that many of these things that African Americans had were not equal. Schools, railroads, buses, cars, houses, they were not equal to the quality and condition of what whites had. But again, this law will be overturned as well. Slowly over time, the courts decided to remedy or fix the past discrimination against race. Schools and discrimination. African American and white children were once separated by race in terms of education. You may know that. The Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka in 1954 ruled schools using segregation unconstitutional. Okay, this meant that now African American children and white children should go and be allowed to go to school together. While the decision was controversial, sorry for the typo there, students of any race could now attend schools in their local school districts without being forced out to go to another school 20 miles away. In 1971, the Supreme Court ruled that busing was constitutional in another controversial issue. Students would be transported to other schools to ensure racial integration of whites and blacks. Americans who supported this decision said busing was required to create equality, while others who opposed the decision said busing forced students away from their schools, local schools, and friends, excuse me, which also led to what we call white flight from cities. A lot of people moved away from cities because of this busing policy. Now, the practice was ended in 2001 when courts decided that school integration had indeed taken place. Continuing schools and discrimination, the courts and the government have also tried to remedy the effects of discrimination in schools of higher education, such as colleges and universities. Colleges or universities may admit students of minority races over white students to help achieve racial integration, and this is known as affirmative action and has become very controversial as well. Alan Bake, who you see here, a 33-year-old white engineering student, decided to sue the University of California at Davis when they refused to admit him over minority students. He was denied admittance to the school because he was white and they wanted to get more minority students in. Again, they were trying to get racially integrated, but the Supreme Court ruled in Regents of University of California versus Bake, 1978, that the school's policy of admitting minority students over white students was illegal, sorry for the typo there, and unconstitutional. Schools of higher education, such as colleges and universities still today, struggle with the proper balance of racial integration, right? We want to make sure we have, a good resemblance of minority students, but we also don't want to punish white students as well by, not allowing them to enter the school as well. So it's a constant battle there in colleges and universities. Work and discrimination, 1964. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, was passed by Congress. Discrimination in employment due to race, color, sex, religion, or national origin is prohibited under Title VII of this law. Both of these requirements prohibit discrimination in public and private locations of employment. Requirements by employers are enforced by the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, Just like affirmative action, some race-based programs used in employment practices are controversial, such as employers should have a good representation of all races and genders. Again, that might mean that maybe if you're a white male or a white female, you might not get that position you would like, or even a black male or a black female, because they need to create a balance with the races and the sexes. Okay, so a lot of people say this is unfair and controversial as well. The right to vote. States have the power to control their elections and voting. Discrimination was used in the past to prevent certain groups, such as African Americans, from their constitutional right to vote. Literacy test, meaning that African Americans had to prove they could read and write before they were allowed to vote. And poll taxes, being able to pay to vote, prevented many from voting, especially in the South. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, passed by Congress, banned these forms of discrimination and segregation in terms of voting rights. Gerrymandering, which is used to determine voting districts, was also used to prevent certain groups of different races from having a voice in government. Maybe blacks or African Americans lived in a certain white section and they might have been put in that white neighborhood to vote, so they couldn't have a say in their government. Um, that's now been fixed to make sure that everybody has an equal say and equal voice in how they vote. So more equal and more representational races in terms of voting. While advances have been made against discrimination in terms of race, some minority groups are pushing for what is known as collective rights. This means that members of a certain group who have common similarities may look to remedy discrimination together. Some people say this would be good because they could work together for a common cause. Other people say it's not a good idea because every group is different, every group wants different things. All right, our closure. How is discrimination against race protected under the law? Think about education, think about work, think about the right to vote, and how has this changed over time? All right, please let me know if you have any questions or concerns. Try your best on the questions that follow, and I hope to talk to y'all soon. Take care, everyone. Bye bye.